Troy, you know, welcome. You're very welcome.
Just looking around to see if there's anyone else here. I guess you're talking to me.
I'm talking to you, the only guy with hair in this conversation.
Another thing I'm grateful for. Whatever color it may be these days.
Oh my God, you don't even know.
Oh, I know.
I would go for that. So, and not for the vanity, just for the warmth.
The sunburn protection.
I don't know if you remember, you probably don't, but I wrote you years ago when I saw one of your videos, and I said I was just astounded by the kind of work that you did, the kind of detailed work, actually, that I really, obsess over. Some people really don't care about technique at all, but the work, I even remember what I wrote to you, I think that your work is worthy of some kind of doctoral, honorary doctoral degree. Because, no, seriously, like, nobody, I don't know anybody who is actually, you've interjected nomenclature into the shred world.
Yes, sometimes, too many nomenclatures, and we have to then prune them back out when we realize that's too many words and they lead people astray. But yeah, we're guilty of neologizing.
But that's okay, because I think that what you've done is you've brought awareness to something that people weren't paying attention to, and that has opened up possibilities where people saw roadblocks prior. But before we get into what that nomenclature is and what the meaning behind it is and what actually the word nomenclature means, what is your musical background? Like, did you go to music school? How did you figure things out, and how did you get to where you are now in terms of your music education?
Musically, no, I did not go to music school. I did take some more higher learning type of music classes in college, but probably by that point I knew most of what you would think, your sort of informed pop music listener would know. I just didn't know the names for some of them. So like I didn't know, I forget when it was that I figured out that I had been playing in modes, but I didn't know that they were called modes. I was just like, oh, that's C major, but there's a B flat in there, and you have to remember that because that chord is sometimes, you can go C major, B flat, F, and then back to C. That's technically an F key signature, but it's definitely, that song's definitely in C. And so like, in my mind, that's how I thought about it. And at the same time, of course, in the 80s, like everybody else, you'd be reading guitar magazines, and they're talking about, Mixolydian, and I didn't realize that was the same thing. So, and so to back into your question, like everyone else, I listened to the radio and, picked up tunes off the radio, and keyboard's my first instrument. So I'm from Long Island, where Billy Joel is a national religion. So you had to be able to play Angry Young Man, Root Beer Rag, Scenes from an Italian Restaurant, all the stuff, right? And so that's what I did first.
Didn't a lot of people convert out of that?
No.
Didn't a lot of people convert out of that religion?
I hope not. I will find them, and they will be punished severely. No, actually, I think Billy Joel is amazing. I mean, in my top three would be like Billy Joel, Stevie Wonder, and Eddie Van Halen. So, you have keyboard. They were all people who had some amount of instrumental virtuosity, but also wrote incredible songs, usually by themselves. So, in that sense, my musical upbringing was pretty typical. I mean, my parents are boomers. Not a fun thing to be now, apparently. But they were rock fans, and they went to shows in the 60s before there really was, not every band went to Madison Square Garden. Some of them just went to these local clubs on Long Island, and you would go and you get to see like Canned Heat or Jimi Hendrix or something playing at some smallish place. So the thing I thank my parents for is that to them, Eric Clapton was a genius, or Billy Joel was a genius. So if you tell a certain kind of parent, hey, I might want to do something with music, they're just going to be like, what are you, crazy? You got to be a dentist. Whereas in my household, it was pretty much understood that these people were to be respected and admired for this kind of otherworldly skill that they have. And I think that sort of, that trickled down, even it wasn't in any way, it wasn't authoritarian at all, but it's, when your authority figures are positive about a thing in a very casual way, that it has a way of rubbing off. And we had a lot of musicians in my family. So to me, music was like one of those skills, like speaking foreign language was another one, where it's like, oh, if you could do that, that's a cut above, and that's a valuable skill to have, and it'll pay dividends later in life, and you should get that. So when I got to college, I actually was a language major. That's actually what I studied. I was an Italian language major, and I took Spanish and German also. Right. But my official concentration was Italian and Dante specifically. But when I was there, I took kind of, your intro theory courses and then snuck into a higher level symphony course where I didn't actually finish the theory sequence. But by that point, I kind of knew what I didn't know. And so I snuck into this theory, or snuck into a symphony course, which was really awesome. And it was basically like reading the scores of symphonies, kind of like you would read. It was like a lit course, but for music. So, I remember one of the questions, just one lecture, he was like, in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, why does the famous motif is sort of compared to knocking on a door, right? Dun, 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 dun. And he's like, why do they knock twice? And I was like, oh, because the first knock is the tonic and the second knock is the dominant. He's like, very good, So because it's, C minor and then G7 and then C minor. So that was really cool because that was kind of like the synthesis of everything I had done musically up until that point. It was like your fun listening stuff, your ear training, but you're also your academic, where you get to sit around and dish about like why someone wrote this amazing complicated thing the way they did and what they were trying to say with these various kind of harmonic movements and stuff. But academically, that's as far as it went. I wasn't going to be a music professor. No offense to those who were. I don't have that kind of constitution. I don't. So, I have a certain limited attention span. Like I've risen to exactly the level of attention span in life in doing what we do now that exactly fits, the ADD brain that I have. So like a little bit of the technical stuff, but also a lot of the practical as well. Hopefully, maybe helping people, learn these things. So I guess the only thing I'd add to that is alongside this whole thing, I'd picked up guitar at one point and was fairly immediately disappointed with how little I could do the picking stuff. And that's kind of what led into what we do now. Like there just was, unlike piano, very much unlike piano, the technical aspect of playing guitar was not a thing that progressed in a linear fashion. It was, on keyboards, if you spent a lot of time working on a piece, it got better, like almost uniformly. And at this point, I would have to say I think that the technique on piano is much easier to get in the door. There's a lot less mechanical complexity because a lot of that is hiding under the lid. If you open it up, you see thousands of moving parts in there. Those moving parts are the things that are actually hitting the string, whereas on the guitar, of course, you have to do that yourself. And this idea of how to get in between the strings and play the notes at a high speed while getting to the other strings with some sort of efficiency, this is not a given. You don't just quote-unquote practice and get better at that. If you're Yngwie or Eddie Van Halen, you do, but not without accidentally and subconsciously figuring out things about the way the instrument works, which aren't really necessary on a keyboard instrument. So having this experience of having worked on hard pieces, even little bits of them, like in high school, I remember I got a page of the Chopin Great Waltz in A-flat major. It's that one, dun 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 dun. It's like tenths in the right hand and all this stuff. And it's like the epitome of the kind of thing that a kid thinks great piano players play, because it's giant spread hands moving all over the keyboard. And I remember seeing it in a car commercial. It was like a Mercedes commercial where they roll up the windows and the guy's playing the Chopin, and they're trying to show you how quiet it is in the ride, So I got the sheet music for this, and I learned a few bars of it. And after half a page, I was like, oh, I could do this. I'm not going to, because again, I don't have that attention span. I'm going to go back to my Billy Joel. But the idea that kind of technique is even approachable in pieces to a teenager is cool and fun and inspiring. But guitar, I couldn't play a scale. Like, you flip that script around. Why is it every time I feel like I can kind of play fast, but when I try to move across the strings, it feels all kinds of sticky and I'm making lots of mistakes? And you take a lesson or two here and there, and people tell you, well, you got to go slow and get all the notes right, and you use your metronome, and whatever the advice was, during the day. But it gradually sort of dawned on me at some point, and I was just like, I think it was probably the end of high school, beginning of college, when at some point I just sort of had enough. And I decided, there's got to be a trick to this. I just don't know what it is. And it turned out, of course, that in a manner of speaking, there is a trick to it. There are lots of tricks to it. And the first of these kind of trick breakthroughs, if you will, was something that I stumbled upon not too long after having had this sort of frustrated realization that there must be something I have to figure out here. It can't just be a natural ability thing, because why can I do these other things but I can't do this? Even on guitar, everyone can, everyone who tries, everybody gets that, like right away, and other things. And these things aren't exactly trivially easy, but everyone gets those. But why is it does it seem that even at these elite levels, there's a massive gulf between a very small number of people who have great picking technique and everybody else. And this includes like amazing players, people that we worship for their musical knowledge, for their songwriting ability, but yet not everybody, even very dedicated people, can do the picking every note thing. That's what we called it back in the day, right? Picking every note. So, you know, there was at some level this kind of subconscious, like there must be some trick here, you know, and soon enough, you know, I stumbled across one of the tricks, and things were rather exciting at that point. But I won't.
And what?
Go ahead. Sorry.
And what was that trick?
So basically, it turns out that picking motions follow a trajectory, and that the shape of this trajectory determines how you can move from one string to another with efficiency. In other words, you know, you look at somebody playing guitar, you think they're just like doing this. They're moving their hand back and forth, they're playing notes, right? But what you don't notice is that if you look down the strings this way, what you think is maybe a side-to-side picking motion might actually be moving more like this. And what I'm doing here is I'm generating picking motion where downstrokes sort of move toward the guitar and upstrokes move away. And I now call this an upstroke escape type picking motion. And what I mean by that is very simply that when you play a downstroke, you tend to kind of move toward, if not hit the body. And you're kind of stuck down here underneath the string and you can't get out. Whereas when you move away from the body, you have now, and I'm exaggerating this, but there's an air gap between the pick and the strings. And the term for this that we created is escape. So the pick escapes when you play an upstroke. And it turns out that great players always make an escape motion when they move across the strings. So what happened in my case, basically, was that, and I'm just sort of recreating, you know, to the best of my recollection, what I think probably happened is I was probably using this type of picking motion, but I didn't know it. And I was just tooling around in the dorm room, you know, one day, like playing my Yngwie instructional videotape, and my roommates were just sort of milling around. And I just sort of accidentally, you know, here's the accident, the happy accident was playing a phrase that was constructed of all even numbers of notes per string. And it was a phrase sort of like this. And the idea here is that suddenly I could kind of play a line that moved across all 6 strings or 5 strings of the guitar, and I was never able to do that before, not with any kind of smoothness. You know, previously trying to play something fast was just kind of sort of felt sticky, and it was like a banging into things. I didn't know what was going on. But somehow I played this line or something similar to it. And all of a sudden it's very smooth, like you couldn't tell when you were moving from one string to another. And because I had kind of been annoyed by this problem, and I think probably because at some point I'd actually verbalized, you know, there's got to be some trick here. As soon as I did this, I realized that I had done this. And I was like, whoa, why did that?
And what age were you?
Probably about like 19 or 20 or something like that. So like not super young. I wasn't, you know, some Sean Lane 14-year-old genius kind of a thing. It's, you know, I had been playing for 5 or 6 years, and I had no real substantial command of picking technique, which is kind of a, you know, a dispiriting situation. But, you know, looking back, obviously, within a very short period of time of playing guitar, I'd probably kind of overcome a lot of the basic mechanical hurdles that most people do. Like you can do a bar chord. It's not hard. You know, it feels really weird at first, but after, you know, 6 months or something, when you're a teenager especially, it feels easy. And then, you know, I didn't have the fastest picking motion in the world. In fact, I didn't even know, and it would be years before I even bothered to think about what sort of joint motion I was even using. So I don't even know. Like, I don't have video of it. It was practically, you know, prehistoric times. So no one had phone cameras. I don't know what kind of picking motion I used, but my best guess is that it was probably an upstroke escape style picking motion. In other words, it was one of these diagonal motions, which are very common. A lot of people learn them. And the trick here, and we're probably, I don't know if I explained this properly, we're meandering a bit, but the trick here is that you take this type of picking motion, and the secret sauce, if you will, is that you only want to switch strings when you play an upstroke. And so if you are someone who has played for a long time and you never thought about your picking motion, and if it happens to be this kind of picking motion, then you take that motion and you specifically pair it with phrases where the final note on every string is an upstroke. And when you do that, the process of moving from one string to another becomes perfectly simple. It's totally smooth. There's no jumping motion. You're not going to bang into any wrong notes or anything like that. So, and that was essentially, I think, what happened in my case, because I was working on all these Yngwie style licks. And a lot of Yngwie phrases are even numbered patterns, where he does things on a single string, like, which is that famous sort of 6-note sequence that Yngwie does, where it's. Well, one of the interesting properties of this sequence is that if you start it on a downstroke, it always ends on an upstroke. And so not only does this help you play it fast on a single string, because you can kind of conceptualize that initial downstroke and just forget about the other notes. So you can go. So in my mind, I'm playing what you hear is, but what I'm actually playing in my mind is, and I'm basically ignoring the 5 subsequent notes of the pattern, and just imagining that that first note of the pattern has to be a downstroke. Simple enough, right? This is a process that we call chunking, and it's a motor learning concept where you take like continuous actions and you bundle them up into like subunits, and you just focus on one of the notes within the subunit, and then you end up learning those 6 notes as kind of one thing. So when you play this pattern, and when you get good at it, you're not really playing 6 notes anymore. You're playing one note, essentially, or one motor program. It's just one sort of firing of neurons that generates the motion to play all 6 notes. But the other property of this, which is really cool and very powerful, is that because it's 6 notes and you're starting on a downstroke, the last note is an upstroke. And what that means is if, again, you have this type of upstroke escape picking motion, and you start on one string, you can move to a new string right at the juncture where the next pattern would start, and the final upstroke will go up in the air and go over the top of the next string and come right down on the other one. So the simplest case would be if I were to start this on the E string and then move to the B string. Now the transition is seamless. You can't feel it when you do this. It's just this continuous motion. And you say, well, why don't I have to make a jumping motion to get over the string? Well, because the picking motion is doing that on its own. So it's going. Again, I'm exaggerating this, but the pick is up in the air, and then to drop down on the B string takes like basically 0 effort. And then to transition that across the strings, you're just playing these units of 6, and it feels almost no different than playing it on one string. And so as soon as I did this, and I did this by accident, and again, I think it was the fact that I was actually doing this type of picking motion, I just didn't know it. And when I was a teenager, you know, trying to play arbitrary things that didn't fit the picking motion would feel kind of weird and sticky. Like if you were playing a phrase where the last note on the string was a downstroke, you'd feel that. Because, and we know now because we have cameras and we can film these things, if a player has this as their picking motion, they try to move to a new string when they play a downstroke, their hand learns over time that it has to get over the string, and that's when it does make a jumping motion, this kind of motion, which we call string hopping now. And so when a person's primary motion is an upstroke escape picking motion, but they try to play a line where they switched strings during a downstroke, they get this sudden, it's like hitting a speed bump, because the hand makes like an inefficient jumping motion to try and get over the string. It stops doing the smooth, kind of back and forth, efficient, fast motion, and it switches to this less efficient jumping motion. And so this actually, if you don't know that you have this kind of picking motion, you try to play a scale, or especially if you try to do something complicated where you have one note on a string or mixtures of 1, 2, and 3 notes on a string, it can feel super awkward because your hand is basically doing this as it's trying to get across the string. And you don't know why, and it's all automatic because your hands are incredibly smart. They learn this. They learn to be clean. Like you've told your hands, I don't want to play wrong notes. So the hand's like, okay, I guess I got to go over the string to avoid, you know, hitting multiple strings at once. But of course, it only knows how to do that the efficient way, which is the upstroke way. So if you force it to do it on a downstroke, it does the inefficient way. And the very common result, which we can see now with cameras, is this inefficient bouncing motion. So subsequently, as a test, actually, you can do this test yourself to determine what type of escape motion you're using. You don't even really have to know much about the mechanics. All you have to do is play a phrase that has an even number of notes per string and try to move it across the string while starting on a downstroke. Now, start it on an upstroke and try to move it across the string. If one way is really easy and smooth and the other way feels all kinds of bouncy and you get arm tension and slowness, then that's telling you that that motion is probably the string hopping motion and the other one is probably the efficient motion. And this is a test that we now use.
Yeah.
So fast forward, you know, however many decades later, and we have all this footage of having interviewed these great players and filmed not only famous people, but regular people who are learning, or regular people who are great musicians but have been playing for decades, never really knew what their picking motion was. You get a camera on them and you look and you can see now they're actually making these escape motions. They just never knew. And there are all sorts of ways to generate them. In fact, there are so many ways that anyone who's been playing for almost any length of time probably already does one of these motions, they just don't know it. And so it is almost enough in a lot of cases to tell someone, oh, I see, okay, you're making an upstroke escape motion. So you're going to find phrases where the upstroke is the last note on the string to be the really easy ones. Or you're making a downstroke escape motion, and you're probably going to find phrases where the downstroke is the last note on the string to be the really easy one. And even though there's an enormous wealth of different ways to do picking motions, they kind of fall into kind of 3 or 4 big categories. And once you learn to identify them, you realize that there are sort of very common correlations between the type of picking motion that a person has and the kind of escape that they make. So this upstroke escape is just the one that I was using. It's one of the very common categories. Specifically, the motion I'm doing here looks a lot like what gypsy players do. This.
Yeah.
It's a combination of forearm rotation and wrist motion with this kind of flex in the wrist here. Looks like you're carrying a cat or a football. Mm-hmm. And this motion, when you do this, it naturally generates an upstroke escape, and that's just the way that motion works. You don't have to think about that or try to make the pick go up in the air when you play an upstroke. You just do this motion, and the upstroke, the motion that it generates is an upstroke escape motion. But on the flip side, for example, a very common, probably the most common downstroke escape picking motion is the one that Al Di Meola uses, which looks like this. Now, Al is sort of famously a wrist player, right? And he puts the whole arm on the guitar, and then just the hand moves back and forth. So to look at this from this perspective, it just looks like the hand's going side to side. But if you look at it this way, and I'll exaggerate it a little bit, what's actually happening is the downstroke is going up in the air. So players with Al's style of picking motion, and there are tons and tons and tons of them, like Andy Wood, John McLaughlin, Andy James, and Metal. This type of picking motion is an extremely common picking motion. This is a downstroke escape motion. So players who do this will find it easiest when they play phrases where the last note on the string is a downstroke. And so a very common, a very simple example of that would be a phrase like this. And it's just an overlapping sequence of 6 notes where the string change happens right in the middle of the phrase. So if I play 6 notes ascending, I'm doing 3 notes on the lower string and then 3 notes on the next higher string. So in this case, if I'm doing it in A, start on the A on the low string, I play 3 notes, down, up, down, and you can see that downstroke just sails right over the top of the next string. You come back on an on an upstroke and finish. So you get 6 uninterrupted notes straight up right across from one string to another. You don't even feel the transition between the strings. And then you start over on that same next string. So if I start over on the A string, and then again on the D. So in my mind, it's just 6 notes ascending. But because I start over on the same string where I finished, that the transition from one string to another always happens on the 3rd note. And that 3rd note is always a downstroke. And this phrase is so common that pretty much anyone with this picking motion probably plays it already. It's probably in their vocabulary. And this is kind of just the genius of people. You know, just tooling around when you were a teenager, if you were intuitive and you were, especially if you were good with sports or good with video games, you probably figured this stuff out without maybe even realizing it. And especially you watch an instructional video or two where Paul Gilbert gets up there and shows you how to do this lick. If you have this kind of picking motion, that lick will immediately be easy for you. Whereas if you have my picking motion, that lick will be impossible. Because this sort of picking motion, or the picking motion that I had when I was a teenager, I would have needed to play an entirely different vocabulary to find that easy. I would have needed the upstroke to be the last note on the string, not the downstroke. So these are just 2 examples of very common picking motions that sort of fit these, that do this kind of escape thing that we're talking about.
So are you saying that at this point you're playing that you're basically interchanging between both upward and downward pick escape to do whatever it is that you're trying to do?
Well, the way I think of it is more like a language. So this style of playing is its style unto itself, and the gypsy players play this way. Once I get into this form, this is the only picking motion I make. So when I play in this style, my whole vocabulary changes. It's like speaking Italian versus speaking Spanish. So when I'm playing, in gypsy style, let's say, then I'm only playing phrases that fit this kind of picking motion where the upstroke is the last note on the string, and there's another ingredient to this that becomes possible when you use these types of picking motions, and that's sweeping. So in the, let's call it the gypsy style upstroke escape motion, you're going to be playing phrases where the last note on the string is an upstroke. And very commonly, these are going to be even numbers of notes per string, where you play either 2 notes on a string, like a pentatonic scale, 4 notes on a string, like chromatic, But the secret superpower you get because of the sort of curvature of the arm here, and this is a thing we haven't talked about yet, but you notice what it's doing to the pick also. It's making it appear angled. And this was kind of the first of the terms that we created that confused everybody, which is pick slanting. And that is this idea that the pick is leaning in one way or another. It's not the motion. The motion is the escape business, which we were talking about. But the fact that the pick is leaning is necessary because the motion is angled. And
you do realize that everybody, I mean, I've seen not everybody, but I've seen so many people use pick slanting. Like they write pick slanting and, well, Troy, it's all your fault.
It is, yeah, it is. And I think the problem there was, when I first did this in college, right, so the first thing I noticed was that the pick was angled like this. But of course, at the same time, I also noticed that I was going up in the air when I played the upstrokes. And in my mind, I didn't really differentiate the two. I was just like, okay, yeah. And I just called it all pick slanting. I didn't really think about that the motion was somehow separate from the whatever it is that's causing the pick to appear that way. So in some of our early teaching, I think we were guilty of glossing over this difference. So imagine, for example, that you're Al Di Meola, or that you're someone who has Al's picking motion. This is a downstroke escape picking motion. You can't change that. There's nothing you can do to the angle of the pick that will change the fact that the pick goes up in the air when you play a downstroke. So if you watch our video on Yngwie Malmsteen and you see, well, that's downward pick slanting, or gypsy style playing, or Eric Johnson, where they all have this downward pick slant, well, your picking motion is this. And you can't do something with your fingers, like let's say I do this to make the pick appear slanted. Well, now all I've done is mess up my picking motion. Because what happens now is I'm gonna make that motion. But when I come back on the upstroke, it's gonna like stick under the string because I changed the pick slant, but I didn't change the motion. So to do an upstroke escape picking motion that looks like Al's motion, where it's the hand moving sideways like that, the way that you achieve that is by changing, well, and Al's a wrist player, so the way that you achieve that is by changing the direction the wrist is moving like this. And that's Mike Stern's picking motion. Notice it doesn't look like a gypsy technique, which would be this, where I'm using more forearm motion, and I've got this bend in the wrist and this very obvious downward pick slant. Mike Stern's technique is very similar to Al's. It's kind of like the mirror image. So he's resting on the body like this. It looks, from this perspective, exactly the same. So the Di Meola world, or the John McLaughlin world, you're going to be playing lines where the downstroke is the final note on the string because the picking motion moves this way when you do a downstroke. The Stern world, or similar, you're going to be playing lines where the final note on the string is an upstroke because the pick moves this way up towards my face when I play an upstroke. They look almost identical. Mechanically, the way that that's being achieved, if we take the guitar out of the equation, and I just go like this, the Di Meola motion actually goes like this. Goes up and to my right.
Yeah.
The Stern motion actually doesn't go up at all. It just goes sideways. But my arm is tilted like this. So if I make a sideways motion with my arm tilted, that upstroke is going to come towards my face. The Di Meola motion, on the other hand, even with a slight tilt to my arm, is still going to go that way. So these are actually, believe it or not, even though, from this perspective, again, that's Al's motion. There's Mike's motion. They look identical, but they're actually two different wrist motions. If, again, we take the guitar out of the equation and I point my hand towards the camera, Al's motion is doing this. Mike's motion is doing this. How different are they? About this different. So Al's motion is maybe tilted kind of like this. Mike's motion is perfectly side to side. But I'm achieving that not by turning my arm. I'm not changing the pick slant as perhaps we have led those astray in years past. All I'm doing is just changing the direction my wrist is going. So instead of moving up and to the right with my wrist, I move side to side with my wrist. Now, I know that a lot of this sounds confusing, but the takeaway here is that people already do this. Regular people already do this. They just don't know it. And until they know it, some phrases are going to feel hard to them and others will feel easy and they won't know why. So we came along and we put a word on it. We gave an awareness to this idea that the picking motion has to match the phrase in some way.
Well, I saw the video that you did, which I thought was great, when you had the total beginner play to see, and see what it would be like if she played as fast as she could, and then you identified what she was doing, which is a fantastic video that everyone should watch. It actually is going to kind of lead into something else, but I have a different question, and that is, let's say there are, whatever, 50 players that are watching this right now, or hopefully 50,000, and they realize, they just identified, because of what you just described, they just identified, hey, I'm doing downward pick escape, or I'm doing Mike Stern's upward pick escape. Where do they go from there?
Well, so I mean, the simplest thing is to just, if you do that, we talked about the test for that earlier, you just take a phrase that has an even number of notes, and you play the phrase starting on a downstroke, and it has to move across the strings. Because if it doesn't move across the strings, then you're not incurring the mechanical penalty of potentially hitting something. This test works best if you're experienced, because people who have played for a long time have actually learned these things through years of training. They just don't know that they've learned them. And one of the things that they've learned is this ability to do the wrong motion, the string hopping motion. And so they have this default, or what I call the primary motion. It's like the Stern motion, or the Demiola motion, or the Gypsy one. There's 20 of them or something that are common. You have your primary, but if I force you to go outside of that, you're going to do the inefficient motion. And it's going to feel wrong. It's going to be slow. You're going to feel arm tension. So you take the test, and the test tells you which escape your picking motion actually does. So you don't even have to really know what the joint motion is so much, although it's helpful, because there are some markers and things that you can look for where as soon as I see a person sit up on the guitar and they look like this, I know they're a downstroke escape player. They're at least a downstroke escape player, because that's Al's technique, and I can tell from the anchor points and the arm position already before they even play. I already know what their picking motion is going to be, and then I say, okay, now play me a pentatonic scale and start on a downstroke. Now start on an upstroke. And if they get really awkward when they start on a downstroke, then I know I have my answer. So you take these tests, you determine what your escape is, and then to unleash its true fury and power, you just have to pair that motion with phrases where the final note on the string matches your escape. So if you're a downstroke escape player, you want to play lines where the last note on the string is a downstroke. If you're an upstroke escape player, you want to play lines where the last note on the string is an upstroke. And these things aren't that, I know that maybe sounds like a little bit weird and clinical, like, well, why would I just want to play, I don't want to think about these things. Well, you don't think about it. Great improvisers don't think. They just kind of do this stuff. Like if I'm, once you get a vocabulary under your fingers, you can create on the fly without having to kind of think about the pick stroke and what the last note is. You just learn it like words. I mean, grammar has complicated. There's rules, but it eventually becomes automatic.
Well, that's like one of the big critiques that I've heard. I'm an economy picker mostly, but I play with a thumb pick, so there's some weird stuff going on anyways. But one of the things that you hear people criticize about economy picking is that I don't want to have to play in a certain way, with starting on a certain stroke and doing a certain kind of pattern in order to accommodate my technique, because now I've veered away from improvisation.
Except that's wrong, and we know that's wrong. We can prove that it's wrong, because if you don't do economy, what else do? You do something, and that thing has rules, and you obey those rules. Even you're just not conscious of it. In the same way that speakers of German aren't annoyed at having to decline every adjective and work in 5 cases. Like they have masculine, feminine, and neuter, and it's annoying to an outsider, but it's all memorized to them. They don't have to worry about it. So if you're an economy player, it's all memorized. We interviewed Frank Gambale. That stuff is all, he has his tendencies, and they're very obvious and very clear under the camera. But they're automatic to him. He doesn't have to think about those patterns, because they're just motions that have been completely memorized. So the typical example would be somebody who's like, well, I don't want to do that. I'm going to use alternate picking because I don't want to have to deal with starting on a particular pick stroke. Okay, Mr. Alternate Picker, how often in your life, great alternate picker, have you played this? Like the Eric Johnson 5-note pattern. Right, so very common pattern for anybody who uses upstroke escape motion is this Eric Johnson 5-note sequence. And yes, it works in a certain way. You have to start on a downstroke, and there's a sweep in there, 1 sweep, and 4 alternate pick notes. And it seems kind of rigid. Well, you have to start on a downstroke. It doesn't work on an upstroke. Well, I want to use alternate picking, so I don't have to obey those rules. Okay, great. Well, how many times have you played that line at that speed with that level of accuracy? 0? Because that's what most pure alternate pickers will do, 0. Why? They're not aware or conscious of avoiding that phrase, but they are. Because you can line up the world's greatest pure alternate pickers, from Albert Lee to Steve Morse to whatever, and you just don't see that kind of phrasing in their vocabulary. Why? Because their technique is not really idiomatic for alternate picking, and even though it is something you could learn to play, it is not obvious that you should learn to play it. When people are really good at alternate picking, they tend to play the kind of alternate picking things that we would all play if we were good at alternate picking, like a 3-note per string scale, or sequency patterns that are hard and move in between the strings. But, they're very rarely doing, you will very rarely see patterns like these economy, or what I call one-way economy type patterns, like these Eric Johnson things. Right? That's like a 5-note sequence repeated. Well, 5s is weird because if you're an alternate picker, that means every time you start that pattern over again, it's going to be on the opposite pick stroke. And not only that, but it's 2 strings. So somewhere in there, you're going to have to switch strings. That's torturous. So to do that kind of pattern, or the Eric Johnson 5-note sequence, is going to be, you're going to need like elite level alternate picking skills. Or you can have regular person economy picking skills and play it. It's up to you. But I think my point is that this idea that one picking motion is the superior one because it frees you to be improvisational is a lie, essentially a lie, because you're not really free. You're avoiding certain phrases and choosing others because they're more suited to your technique, or they're more obvious to you to choose musically. You're not actually going everywhere or playing everything. You're only going and playing the things that you've worked on, and you're kind of pretty assiduously avoiding all the others. So again, could you play the Eric Johnson 5s pattern with alternate picking? Yes, you could do it. Would it occur to you to do it? Not very likely. At least I can only conclude that it's not very likely, since very few people actually play it who do alternate picking. And at the same time, will it be harder? I mean, maybe. That's like a thing where we'd have to test. You get 100 virtuosos in each camp, and then you see what their error rate is when they play these things. I mean, what I can tell you is that these economy things I have on my worst day. I could wake up with a fever, tired, sick, hungry, not warmed up, and this kind of worst day, I can do that, like with almost no warm-up at all. Why? Because these gypsy-style kind of techniques, these one-way economy techniques, are really reliable for me. So I will grant you that that's anecdotal. But I do feel like there's a certain hit rate with those that's kind of hard to achieve. Or maybe the flip side is the hit rate is good with these, and that's why people play these patterns. Because they're easy to do. You can play this thing 10 times, and 9 out of 10 times it's going to sound pretty good. And even if you screw it up, it's not going to, the whole thing, you're not going to screw it up. You're not likely to screw it up because it works in such a very specific way. These string changes are a particular way. The sweeps are all in a particular spot. These little kind of units that it's built on, this downstroke sweep where you have 2 downstrokes and then an upstroke, that's like you can think of it as almost like a word in your vocabulary. It's really reliable, and you can just chain those things together. Each one of those things is like a word. That's a word. This is a word. This is a word. Just 2 notes on 2 adjoining strings. Also words. So what is improv then? It's the chaining together of the words of your language, right? It's just like in spoken language. So, I mean, everyone has words. You can't not have words. So the pure alternate picker has words. They're just different words. They're not doing the 3-note groupings spread across 2 strings all that often, because doing that with alternate picking is hard. But doing other things with alternate picking, like that's a word. A lot of great alternate pickers can do that, whereas an economy player really doesn't or can't because you have upstroke and downstroke string changes there. So an economy player might do like, and what I'm doing here is sweeping the first string change and legatoing the second one. And I'm using my gypsy technique for that. It's cool, it works. It sounds a little different, but that's cool too. And that leads me to a different creative place. So I think I would encourage everybody to think of picking techniques like a language, and to think of the motions that you chain together as being like the words of your language. And those motions can be used to play different fretting combinations. So the word here, to use our term word, would be down, down, up. That's like a unit or a phoneme in my language. And I can just chain that down, down, up together in all kinds of really interesting ways and come up with all kinds of like cool things that would be really hard, again, with pure alternate, like fours ascending. Try to alternate pick fours across a 3-note per string fingering really fast. Very few people can do that, with that level of speed and with that level of reliability or accuracy. And this is a gypsy technique that's doing it, the simple one, where I can only do downstroke sweeping and only use alternate picking string changes. And you get all these cool ideas that you would never consider otherwise, because who would do like, if I were an alternate picker, I'd probably just go in a straight line because I can. Whereas as a gypsy player, I can't. So I have to come up with these other weird patterns, and the other weird patterns actually sound cooler and take me to a creative place I wouldn't have gone otherwise. So it's all great. I know we're using alternate picking as kind of our whipping post here, but that's not. I don't mean to suggest that. I love all these techniques, and we teach all of them. But what I don't like is the sort of superiority where, oh, this technique is better than the other one. I don't buy it. I never have. Because if they did, if one technique was better, then all the good music would be written by one batch of players, and we already know that's not true.
I wanted to know if you would comment on this, because you have a video. I think it's the same video with the girl playing who has never played before, and you talk about just essentially going for it, and seeing like you use a clip from Sean Lane talking about how he just tried to play, and he tried to play as fast as he could. It was sloppy. And then he cleaned up the slop, and that's how he got better. That's how he lifted his technique up.
So the more natural motion is the more realistic one. That's something we can work with. But if you burn in that string hopping motion over thousands of hours of practice, that's something we're going to have to unlearn, or just throw it out. At the very least, we're going to have to just get rid of it. So I really don't think it's that crazy of a concept that the very first thing your very first step to learning any kind of unfamiliar technique or skill or motor skill, whether it's music or sports or anything else, is to try to do the smoothest, most natural, most realistic version of that technique or skill that you can. And it just so happens that speed is one of the easiest ways to get in that door.
Are you encouraging the learner, like in that? First of all, I think it's a great thing to do. It's a great it's the other side of the coin, which I think is worth really investigating. If somebody is like, yeah, I've worked on this thing really slowly, I still can't get it, just floor it. Like, I think that's actually what you were saying. You said just floor it. But are you also encouraging, let's say that girl, for example, who's the person doing the example on your video, to find out what it is that you do, like, and just pursue that. If you're doing downward pick escape, discover it. Put it under your thumb and get really good at it.
I don't see. Yes. Short answer is yes. It's kind of like saying, if you're good at English, well, why throw that out and start learning some other language? You have one already. Why not learn to use it? What I can tell you from a practical perspective is that it's not always a given that a person's going to be able to learn all these different motions. Sometimes people try to learn a picking motion that they've not done before, and it's not immediately obvious to them how to do it. And one of the things that you see a lot of, especially with the whole like start slow and go faster thing, is that people watch one of our videos and they see, this is how Yngwie plays, or this is how Eric Johnson plays, and we talk about the upstroke escape motion and how it moves kind of on a diagonal. So people will see that and they go, okay, I'm going to do that. They go and they're playing really slow and they do, and they're doing like kind of a very exaggerated, deliberate version of this. But what happens when they speed up? They become Al Di Meola. Why? Because that's the motion they know. So what a very common occurrence is that a person thinks that the thing that they're doing slow is also the same thing as what they're doing fast, and it turns out not to be true, because the thing that they're doing fast is learned, and it's automatic, and you can't turn it off. So you can learn more stuff, but that's a whole other can of worms. Just because you do a thing slow doesn't mean or guarantee that you're going to be able to do it fast. And very often when people try to do that, the motion just morphs to whatever the existing technique is that they already have. And so they're kind of fooling themselves that they're even doing anything different than that. So My approach is always just practical. I want you playing as soon as I can. I want you experiencing the thrill of using the guitar properly, playing with a pick properly, having it feel smooth and efficient, and playing cool things that are inspiring and self-reinforcing. So if I can have that today, I'd much rather have that today than have you spend 6 months trying to learn the whatever better technique you think is better, which may not even be better. It's just a different motion that you don't know. And that's another thing that that you have to talk to people who are still learning about. People have all kinds of weird preconceived notions about what kind of technique they should have versus the one that they have that they, that's elbow though. I don't want to use that one. It's not good. Well, why not? Well, because my teacher said it's not good, or because people on the internet, it looks weird. You get that a lot, actually. People say, I don't like that technique because it looks weird. Why does it matter? Well, whatever. I'm a human. I'm vain. I get it. So you think a thing looks weird, you don't want to do it. But if it works, I'd much rather have a technique that works than one that doesn't. So trying to decide what your technique is great. I also don't think it's a problem if you want to make a hobby out of learning picking motions. That's cool. Like, people who do martial arts who don't intend to get into fights every weekend. So if you want to learn technique and have that be kind of your fun hobby, that's totally cool. I mean, it's my hobby, whether I want it to be or not, just because we have to teach these things. But I still, even for that person, I still think if you're great at something now, you're going to only get better by learning how to use it. So you have the one technique, learn how to play clean, accurate phrases with it, because then at least you'll know what clean, accurate phrases feel like. And then it'll be that much easier to learn some new technique, because you already know what it feels like when it's locked up and you don't make wrong notes and you get from one string to another cleanly. That's a really incredible feeling that everyone should have. If you like, picking all the notes lead playing like we all wanted to do back in the day, it's incredible to actually experience that. And that experience then translates over to all the other techniques you want to learn, where you're like, okay, I know what it's kind of supposed to be like, but I just don't do that motion yet, or I don't have that technique yet, but I know what it's going to feel like, kind of, or I can imagine what it's going to feel like when I get it. And that's incredibly valuable.
Are you teaching privately at all, or if somebody who's watching this is interested in learning from you, do you recommend that they study with you privately, or do you want them to go pursue the membership?
We only do the website thing, and honestly,
right.
I feel like we're on the Blues Brothers. We're on a mission from God. We're trying to do some awesome thing that hasn't been done before, and one of the things that we're working on now on the site is the ability to upload clips of yourself so that we can take a look at and critique your playing. And of course, this is a thing that various other, this exists. We do it on our forum and have done it for years in sort of an unofficial kind of way. Those case studies, a lot of them that we end up putting in our instructional stuff, came from that, of players being, selfless enough, or, who are, I'd be like incredibly awkward, as a teenager putting my bad playing on the internet. But, we've had a lot of players who have thankfully been super open and just said, hey, listen, I want to get better. Here's a clip of my playing. Tell me what you see. And we've done hundreds, thousands maybe of these things over the years. And it's been an incredible learning opportunity to actually see what real people do. And that's where we've learned a lot of this stuff. So a lot of this comes from observation. It's not just that I think things work a certain way, or like I'm a crazy guy sitting in a tower kind of coming up with my own weird theories. Guruism, I think, is a bad thing. It leads to teaching that is very often some type of selection bias that a famous person tells you because they're famous. Because you asked them to tell you a truth, so they told you a truth, or what they believe it to be. But I think you get much better information when you actually can observe. And now, of course, with everybody has a phone that can film, sometimes in slow motion, very detailed slow motion, you can see stuff that just, even as a fan, blows my mind. Regular people will upload, footage of them to their YouTube account and come on our forum and make a post, and we'll get to see from a few inches away exactly what it looks like when 50 people try a phrase, and what are the common pitfalls. That's where the string hopping stuff, that's where that came from. I didn't kind of invent that. It's from looking at people doing a thing and then trying to do the opposite of that thing and seeing what happens. So
I suffered from that. I suffered from that early on, the string hopping thing, and I was like, I cannot alternate pick.
Right.
And then I became like a kind of hybrid picker from there, because I could not, like you said, you just cannot get past a certain point if you're doing
right,
this.
the bouncy, right, exactly. So necessity is the mother of invention, right? You happened upon a technique which is probably maybe even cooler than what you were trying to do with the alternate picking, so that's great too. But as far as like doing the lessons and stuff, I want to develop a way where it's really easy for people to do this kind of investigation of their own playing, because we all learn massive amounts from this. So with any luck, in the next few months, we'll have the upload feature done. And this presents just an incredible opportunity to learn how these things really work. And we have this camera mount thing, which we've made. It's called the magnet, and we use it to mount phones to guitars. And we're getting to the end of the road of actually producing these things so that people can buy them. And we had a Kickstarter for this, went very well. But it turns out this is a very complicated shape to mold. So actually getting these parts to come out exactly the right size with these rubber grips kind of on here that grip the phone turns out to be pretty challenging. But I think we've kind of worked out the kinks of that. So with any luck, within at some point this year, we'll have a lot of people with these things in their hands and access to high-resolution video of their own playing that we can take a look at. And I think, again, that's really how you learn. Nobody, if I do a private lesson, it's like it helps me, but then I have to do that private lesson however many times. But to put the power into people's hands is more exciting to me, because then everybody can take this. I'm not going to be in your house, and even if I were, you still have to be the one that does it. Like you can take a lesson with somebody, and they can show you something, but you still have to be the one to go home and try it 100 times until you get it. And so you need some way of evaluating whether it's right or not. So.
How much will that magnet cost?
Well, the Kickstarter was $50, I think, which honestly, if I'm being honest, I would like it to be cheaper than that, but we're tiny. That's the problem. Is like we're not making 300,000 plastic spoons at Bed Bath & Beyond. So hopefully over time we'll be able to drop that. But we just want to get them out right now because people have paid for these things, and just so you know, they are coming. We did not take your cash.
Right.
So yeah, and I'm personally, the thing that I like and that keeps me going is like I enjoy seeing this stuff. So I'm as much of a nerd, like I get excited when somebody you've never heard of, some student, just like, hey, here's me playing a scale. And I'll go on Instagram and I'll be like, that looks awesome. Can you film that again? Just random people, just like people who comment on our videos. Or they'll tag us and they'll say, here's me playing, XYZ phrase. And I'll go and look at it and be like, hey, that looks really cool. Are you anchoring on the pinky side or the thumb side? Hey, can you turn towards the camera and film that again? I want to look at it. Like I never get tired of looking at this stuff. Hands. It's very creepy.
Do you have... It is. I was going to add that, but you beat me to it. Do you have economy pickers that join as well, or most people not economy pickers?
What is economy, right? So all this gypsy stuff is a form of economy. Eric Johnson's technique is a form of economy. George Benson's technique is a form of economy. So...
like pretty much strict economy.
Well, no one does
up
strict
and down,
economy.
like
Even Frank Gambale doesn't do strict economy. Frank Gambale he's a two-way, one-way economy player. In other words, when Frank is playing lines that descend, like this, he uses upstroke sweeping, but his string changes when he's doing alternate picking are downstrokes. So he's a downstroke escape player. Frank's alternate picking motion is the same as Al Di Meola's. It's this. So you ever notice, if you ever watch Frank solo, you'll see tons of like 2 note per string alternate picking really fast. And he starts always on an upstroke where the downstroke is the last note on the string. And it's not a thing he's ever talked about. We filmed him. You get a really close-up look at exactly what this looks like, which is total trip to watch Frank Gambale kill it in alternate picking. And we put it in our feature on Frank. And he was just like, I thought he was going to be mad. I thought he was going to tell me to take it out or something. Like you can't show me alternate picking. But he was fine. It was fine. But so what I'm getting at is economy styles have as their base an alternate picking motion. That alternate picking has to be one of these alternate picking motions we've been talking about. And if it's one of these escape motions, then that means you have a way of moving from one string to another using alternate picking, but the opposite pick stroke will be your sweeping pick stroke. So in Frank's case, when he's playing these descending lines, his downstroke is an alternate picking string changing motion. His upstroke is a sweep, that kind of thing. So he might... So if I play a pattern like that, I'm going up, 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 down, up, 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 down.
Yeah.
The reason that I can do that is because the downstroke is going over the B string. So that's an escape motion.
Yeah.
And you say, well, I'm not really sure about that. Well, it is because Frank does, again, all these 2 note per string lines, which are pure alternate picked lines. So
I thought his book had like economy picking where he was playing like...
Sure, of course.
As opposed to, like, so he didn't have to do...
So Frank contains multitudes of... I mean, really, he's mechanically incredible. Like, you film him up close, every picking motion that you can think of, he does. It's not, we didn't have a way of seeing this before. I mean, of course, now you can look at old concert footage and you can spot the motions. If you watch our interview with him and you go back and you watch old footage from the 80s, and you're like, oh yeah, look, he's doing that, but you never saw that, you didn't think about that before. How is it actually being done? It's a total trip to look at these great players from a few inches away, and it's like seeing the Matrix. You're like, wow, that's how that works.
Yeah.
So yes, he does those things, but yes, he also does these things. But his Demiola, like, downstroke escape with upstroke sweeping is his most virtuosic mode, I think. It's where, like, a lot of his really cool and interesting phrases are descending lines because they use upstroke sweeping with downstroke string changes when alternate picking. He's like an upside down George Benson, kind of. Of course, he sweeps ascending, so yes, there's a two-way sweeping. I don't want to sell him short. Of course, he does both of these things. But the descending mode is like a high Gothic of that kind of playing. It's very ornate. You have all these upstrokes, sweeping combinations where, again, the words of the improvisational language that we're talking about, you have up, up, down, up, 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 down, and then you have, like, even probably four, like, I can't think of any Frank lines off the top of my head, but where you have, like, up, 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 down. And that down provides the downstroke escape that starts over. Something like that. I'd have... That's not a Frank line, but, like, you could come up with something. But all of those little mechanical units then become the recombinant things that you chain together to create these improvisational lines. And it's completely automatic for him. It's like water, it just totally flows. But those are one-way economy type motions. Almost nobody really just, like, if you only ever moved in a straight line through the strings, you at some point would have to get up over a string to, like, start over again. You can't strictly sweep every phrase that you'd probably want to play, nor you probably wouldn't even try necessarily. You just might not think so much about that moment at the end of the phrase when you have to get over the string and start over. And that's just Frank's formula, if you will, is this one formula for that. Like the two-way sweeping, but where the sweeping and the alternate picking work together. That's just one way. And every player you look at that does this probably has a different fingerprint of sorts. Like we interviewed Oz Noy, who...
How much...
Sorry, go ahead.
Much do you... Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say we interviewed Oz Noy, who's a great two-way economy player, and it's like a slightly different fingerprint. Like he'll do more pure alternate picking in both directions using your demiola motion and your stern motion. So, again, like when you start to look at the actual lines that these players play, you can say, okay, well, I get it. Oz is like a little bit different than Frank because he does things in a slightly different way. But it all boils down to, like, what motions do these players know? Those motions turn into these little words. The words become their improvisational language, and they just mix and match them with different left-hand shapes.
What can a student expect after they have been in your membership program?
I feel like sometimes we teach people so little because they come in already being great. I just tell them what they're already great at. Like a lot of people are like, oh, I suck, I can't do it. And I'm like, that looks awesome, dude. What, are you kidding me? And they're like, thanks,
I need to join this.
I'm the first person to tell you that you're already great. It's just, someone's got to do it. And guitarists are so self-flagellating and insecure sometimes. They're like, oh, I suck because I can't do the whatever. And I'm like, dude, that looks awesome. But I just want you to do more of the thing you're awesome at. And, if you've told yourself that there's some other thing you have to learn how to do, but you're already great at the other thing, then I'm just going to tell you to do more of the other thing. I'm not going to worry too much about, because there's just 50 things I don't know, but I don't worry about the things I don't know. I'm worried more about the things I can do and what cool stuff I can do with those techniques. So again, I think we could attract a lot of experienced players who already are good at something, whatever it is, like a small thing. But I mean, how many picking motions does Eric Johnson have? One, really. I mean, he does that gypsy style motion, and he's just figured out a million cool things to do with it. You really don't need a million techniques. You just need at least one that you're really good at. And if you've been playing for a long time, there's a very good chance that you already have that one. You just need to know what it is, and you need to spend the time to match it up with phrases where it actually fits. So for a lot of people, if they already have some type of picking ability, maybe they don't have the vocabulary yet because they haven't spent a lot of time understanding all the different kinds of phrases that would actually fit with that picking motion. So that can be a lifelong process.
How much do you find yourself practicing these days?
I mean, what is practice, right? Like learning new techniques like every day, all the time, you know, like trying to we film somebody who does some weird thing and then I have to try and figure out how that weird thing works all the time, you know. But what is you know, I think the practice is a very loaded term and it's also super vague.
How about playing? How much are you playing per day?
That's a good question. Maybe it depends. Some days never, not at all, because we're doing work stuff. Some weekends, not at all. Some days an hour, you know, not like I'm not in here hours doing it because I don't have hours to do that. But I'm not, you know, no one comes to me looking to learn to play like me. So it doesn't really matter. It's not like, you know, I'm not like in a band writing songs or, you know, I think people come to us because they want answers. So I do spend, you know, tons and tons of time trying to get those answers for them and provide those answers. And sometimes the answers end up being really simple. You know, like how does a particular technique work? Oh, well, actually there's 3 of them and they work like this. It took me 5 years to figure out how many of the, you know, how does wrist technique work? Well, how many thousands of miles we had to travel and all these people we had to meet to eventually arrive at a very simple or kind of simple explanation of how those techniques, you know, work. It wasn't necessarily me playing all the time though to figure that out. Although some amount of being able to do some of these things definitely helps. But I don't have to become Al Di Meola. I just have to kind of be able to understand, to do the technique enough to understand how it works. And some of these things I'm, you know, pretty comfortable with because I've done them for a long time at this point. But I don't need Frank's entire vocabulary. I don't need Al's entire vocabulary. I just need to be able to do the basic technique at some level that you would consider convincing. And so, you know, that's a smaller order. That's not as you know, impossible.
Well, I just want to say, just in closing, because we've covered a lot here, that I think that the quality and the amount of work, obviously, but the quality of work that you have provided people, even for free, is incredible. I think that is of the highest pedagogical quality in my
free knowledge.
In my professorial.
Get your free knowledge here at Cracking the Code.
Opinion.
Thank you. No, obviously, you know,
exactly.
I know it sounds corny, but like we like helping people. I like helping people because that feeling of like, holy cow, I can do that. Everyone should have that feeling.